Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Marista, for having me present at the University of Tartu. I did have a chance, as was said, to teach a class, which was wonderful. I am something of I would say, a university tourist. I'm the product of academic parents. Universities, for me, are the best places in the world. When I go to countries, I want to see the universities more than I want to see anything else. And I'm interested in seeing basically the great universities of the world. And so for me, Tartu is one of those great ancient medieval universities. So I'm delighted to be here. It was an added advantage that I'm speaking at a university that is not that far from, Königsberg or Kaliningrad. And indeed, I'm speaking at one of the only universities that has a death mask of Immanuel Kant in its museum, which we went to see before the first class. So it's very exciting to be this close to the death mask of Kant as I talk about Kant on Lies today. And I also know that there's a history of having Kant's letters, another of his works, held in the university library. So I feel very close to Kant right now today. But I'm delighted to be here. And as was said, I am working. It's taking me much longer than it should have taken, but I'm working on a short book in the Cambridge University Elements series on Kant on Lies. And really, this talk is my thinking about the framing of the book. So if my talk today convinces you that I'm on the right track, that's good. That means I can continue to work on the book. If people find real problems with my approach, then the publishers are going to have to be told that I'm taking a bit longer. But anyways, I am here to talk about Kant on Lies. And let me just say this. Today, my goal is to try to explain to you, it's kind of Kant interpretation or Kant explication today rather than Kant defense. Essentially, my goal is to explain what I think is the correct understanding of lies in Kant's entire moral philosophy. So unlike the earlier class where I was arguing back and forth about whether Kant may be right or wrong, this talk is really just trying to explain Kant in greater detail than I think has been done before. So if we get to arguing over whether Kant was right or wrong, that will probably be in the question and answer. Okay, so I don't assume that everybody has spent all this time reading Kant, but I did prepare a handout that will be hopefully my guide to what I have to say. If you want to know the conclusion, you can look ahead, but I prefer if you followed me page by page, more or less. But I'm going to try to touch on things on each page. The handout is not merely for show. I'm going to try to use it to make my steps in my argument to my conclusion. So I want to begin then with my title. So Kant and the Three Duties Not to Lie. So the argument of the book, which is not original in the sense that I did say this some years earlier, is that Kant's, essentially the practical philosophy or the moral philosophy, in the end, in his mature writing, Kant thinks that we have three duties not to lie. Not one, not two, but three. And not four and not five, but three. And what I want to do today is to explain these three duties. And if I've explained them sufficiently well, you will see that some questions people raise about Kant on Lies are really sort of inappropriate, but it still leaves us with certain sorts of questions and puzzles. But I wanted to begin not with immediately saying, here are the three different duties not to lie. I wanted to begin with something that is a puzzle for anybody trying to interpret Kant on lies. any scholar, any interpreter, has the following puzzle. If you open up the most famous work of Kant's moral philosophy, the Grundlagen, or the groundwork, right? If you open up the groundwork, you will find a number of claims in the groundwork that really, in the end, present a puzzle. So, reading from my handout, in section 2 of the groundwork, right, published in 1785, Kant talks about examples of duties to ourselves and to other human beings that are perfect and imperfect. So these are ethical duties, perfect and imperfect, duties to ourselves and duties to others, right? So it seems like in this part of the groundwork, among other things, he's going to give us an example of an ethical duty to others. What's this perfect ethical duty to others that Kant is going to talk about? What's the example? Because he's building it up, right? He's saying there is going to be an example of this. What is it? So if you go to the preface of the groundwork, he gives as an example there, thou shalt not lie. So that's just one little suggestion that maybe this perfect ethical duty to others is going to be about lying. Then in section 1 of the groundwork, he says, quote, this is the paragraph, may I, when hard pressed, make a promise with the intention not to keep it. As later versions of the same example make clear, by hard pressed, he means hard pressed for money. And by a promise with the intention not to keep it, he means making a lying promise to get money. So this is where I'm going to say, give me money now and I'll pay you back next week or next month or next year, right? That's the lying promise. Kant argues, I could indeed will the lie, but by no means a universal law to lie. And he concludes that one must be truthful from duty. Granted that to be truthful is a duty not to lie as opposed to a duty to reveal or volunteer information, the conclusion is that he's got a duty not to lie. Now, as I said, I'm not going to talk about his argument here as to why you shouldn't lie. I'm just talking about his claim that there is this ethical duty to others, this perfect ethical duty to others not to lie. Or so it seems, right? That seems to be the example. Now, he then returns to the example in section 2 of the groundwork. He says, Kant argues that a person who acts in accordance with the maxim, when I believe myself to be in need of money, I shall borrow money and promise to repay it, even though I know that this will never happen, violates, as he says, a necessary duty to others or a duty owed to them. So once again, the lying promise violates this perfect or necessary duty to others. So it seems, if you read this part of the groundwork, that Kant is saying that there's a perfect ethical duty to others not to lie, right? I mean, that seems to be just obvious from everything that he says in the groundwork, that one of the ethical duties you have to others, and it's a perfect one, is the duty not to lie. Here's the problem. There is no ethical duty to others not to lie in his moral philosophy. If you read the works that are definitive of his position on lying in the 1797, essentially that year of publication with the Metaphysics of Morals and the On a Supposed Right to Lie from Love of Humanity or Philanthropy, if you read those later works, there is no such ethical duty to others that's perfect. That's a duty not to lie. So why or how does the groundwork give, as one of the most famous cases of a perfect ethical duty, a duty that doesn't exist in his moral philosophy? That's the puzzle. And what I'm trying to do is to explain to you today that we can solve this puzzle without really, I think, doing damage to our interpretation of Kant, and without making Kant out to be inconsistent in some really important way. So that's my claim. How do we solve the puzzle? We have to reread. Okay, so now here's what I want to suggest. Page 2 of the handout. I don't have the time to defend this view of the duties in Kant. I simply would spend all the time doing that today and not the time of explicating his position specifically on lying. So let me just present this without enough argument and support. I believe that the broad structure of this is defensible, but for simplicity's sake, I'm not going to do much of a defense today. I'll just say this. In Kant's moral philosophy, just broadly understood, the moral philosophy includes both basically right or law and ethics. All the duties in Kant can divide up. I've divided them very crudely here as being kind of left and right. So on the left, you have basically what we'll call broadly, very broadly understood, but legal duties. I'll call them legal duties because everything else ends up being confusing. Legal duties has the merit of people thinking of that as being the law and therefore not thinking of it as being the same as ethics. It's trickier when you get into the actual meaning of what it means in Kant, but legal is better as an understanding for us for today. So there are these legal duties in Kant, and legal duties are different from other kinds of duties because legal duties concern actions, duties that basically concern, as we would say, external actions, and they are always narrow. That means that there are no exceptions. And just because we have to say a bit more to understand what Kant means by that, Kant's saying that laws essentially tell you to perform or omit actions that are external in kind, right? Law does not tell you why to do things. It's not concerned with your motives. And law isn't even concerned with adopting ends. Whatever ends you adopt are dealt with in the ethics. But law tells you you shouldn't do certain things or you should do certain things. There are certain kinds of actions. Okay, now, we haven't given examples yet, but if we move over to ethics, ethics is different because really what you have in ethics is duties to adopt or refrain from adopting ends. So ethics are concerned with ends. This is why in ethics you talk about maxims. Maxims have ends, have means to achieve those ends. And in the end, what you're talking about is you internally adopt a certain end, right? So the end of your natural perfection, for example, would be an example of adopting an end in ethics, which would mean basically that you would not be lazy. That would be an ethical duty not to be lazy. The law will be concerned with not turning your car without signaling or something like that. Okay, something like that, right? So ethics is concerned with ends. Now, I don't have the time to defend that distinction today, but that's what you get in the metaphysics of morals. Now, what's interesting is that even though ethics is concerned with ends, ethics can still be either narrow or broad. And again, I don't have time to defend this sufficiently well today, but just because I've worked on this, you can have ethics concerned with ends, and even there, you can have cases where you adopt an end and there can be no question about the sort of things you can't do or can do to achieve the end, versus you adopt an end and there are definitely choices as to what to do or not do to achieve the end. So if you have lots of choice about how to pursue the end of developing your natural talents, it's wide. If you have an end, a kind of an end of self-respect, it's narrow. You basically rule out things you cannot do to yourself in order to be respecting yourself. But in order to be respecting others, there are lots of things you can do or not do for them, lots of time in which you could spend working on yourself versus working on them. So there's a broad and a narrow, or a narrow and a wide distinction within ethics. But even so, you do have in ethics things that are called perfect duties, which are ends that are kind of, in a sense, you cannot ever act against them, and always must be acting for them. And that distinction allows for perfect and imperfect ethical duties. So when Kant in the groundwork talks about perfect and imperfect ethical duties to yourself or to others, that's where these duties should be. They should be in these categories of to oneself, to others, narrow, broad, perfect, imperfect. Now, I've given two ways in which things can be narrow or broad, but that's not as important for us today. What's important for us today is perfect and imperfect only apply in ethics. The distinction is irrelevant in the law, because the law doesn't have something that could be described as wide or imperfect at all. The law is concerned with, narrowly speaking, actions, and the law is only concerned with things that must be done or must not be done. So if I were to go back to the groundwork and I were to find the example of a duty to others that was perfect, that was a duty not to lie, I would find it somewhere on the right-hand side under the wide ethical duties that were either narrow or wide in this further sense, that were either perfect or imperfect in this sense. So let's look at the four cases of ethical duties that we do find in the groundwork. So the four types of duties. So this is, I'm sorry about all the different terms, but I had to figure out something I hadn't used already. So A, B, C, D. So A would be a perfect ethical duty to oneself. That would be, for example, the duty not to commit suicide. That is something that is perfect. There can be no exceptions to the duty not to commit suicide in Kant, and what that really amounts to is a kind of a basically respecting yourself in a kind of a way in which you don't act against your physical nature by killing yourself. Moving across to a case that we all, again, find in the groundwork, but that's an imperfect ethical duty to oneself. So C, the adopting the end of natural perfection, that's the do not be lazy. But what's interesting there is there are many different things that one can do. You're not restricted in terms of the types of things you can do to not be lazy. Some people might go to the gym, some people might, cycle, do yoga, some people might go to the museums to educate themselves, some people might go to, concerts, right? And you can not do it on some days of the week and do it on other days of the week, right? So you've got some flexibility there. You kind of times when you don't have to be exerting yourself and can be at least taking a break. But it's also in the groundwork. Okay, and now I want to move down from the imperfect duty to oneself to the imperfect duty to others. D, adopt the end of promoting the happiness of others. Well, that's the very large, imperfect ethical duty to basically help other people who are in need when you can. And again, you can do that more or less. You can do various different things to help people. You could give them money. You could give them moral support. You could talk to them, or you could give them a lift in your car. There are all sorts of ways. And you don't have to do it every single day, and you can spread it around to do it to different people. So it's imperfect, but it's some amount some of the time. Okay, and that's in the groundwork, and we're clear about that. But now let's move over to the case that I was worrying about, which is B, the perfect ethical duty to others. What about that one? In the groundwork, it seemed like he was saying it was don't lie to others. That seemed to be the case, right? It seemed to be something that you had to never, ever lie, and it was directed towards other people, and you did it from a respect of their rational natures, respecting them as an end in themselves, right? But here's the thing. If you turn to the metaphysics of morals, you don't get lying. What you get, for example, is don't defame people. And he doesn't mean that in a legal sense. He means the following: a duty of virtue not to take malicious pleasure in the exposing of faults of others. So that's something that you should never, ever do. In that sense, it's perfect. There's no break that you can take. You can never, ever, ever take malicious pleasure in the misfortune of others, or exposing, I said, the faults of others, but it's not the duty not to lie. So what's happened? What happened to that famous duty in the groundwork? Well, if you turn to the same work, The Metaphysics of Morals, and you look at the doctrine of virtue, this is where you find the duty in ethics not to lie. He says, and this is the quotation underneath the table on page 2, the greatest violation of a human being's duty to himself, regarded merely as a moral being, the humanity in his own person, is the contrary of truthfulness, lying. So the duty not to lie in Kant's ethics belongs to category A. It's a duty to yourself. It's perfect and it's within the ethics, but it's to yourself. It's not to others. So what happened? Why did it not get why was it not given as an example in the groundwork if in the end, in the later works, it's to yourself? What was going on? Well, let's be clear. There is going to be a problem if Kant were to have two duties in ethics against lying, right? Because, Occam's razor, right? Why would you have one duty against lying in ethics if you have another duty against lying in ethics? It's not like every single wrongful action requires at least two ethical duties against it, right? So given that he's going to claim that it's a duty to yourself not to lie, it seems that he shouldn't have a perfect duty to others not to lie. So the right answer should be that it's not in the ethics as a separate duty to others. But if it's not, why is it in the groundwork? Why did he include it there? So we need a solution to this puzzle. So this is the detective. Okay, so now we're going to explain, now we're going to give my answer to what we should say. Okay, so page 3, right? So hopefully everybody is at least clear on, there's a question. Why did it ever appear in the groundwork? What's going on? Okay, so here's what I want us to think about for a second. And I went through the example quickly, but that's because I didn't want you to think too much about the example before I said, okay, here's my solution, right? What is it that Kant is talking about in this example in the groundwork? What kind of lie is it? People think of it as a lie, sure, but they don't tend to go into the lie all that much. What is it a lie about? Well, it's obviously a lie about getting money and not repaying it. So it's a borrowing lie, it's a lying promise. But what's really crucial about this lie, as I see it, as I'm going to read it, is, well, he didn't pick the example casually. I don't think that Kant would pick an example casually. He chose an example of a lie about money. Why? Was Kant obsessed with money? Well, yes, he was. he used to hide gold under his bed and things like that. But okay, so he was interested in money. But still, that didn't mean that he would give a lie about money just for that reason, right? Just because he had this. No. Here's what I think is going on. This lie about money is a kind of lie that we could say has legal penalties attached to it if you don't follow through. It's a case of fraud. I go to some moneylender, I lie to the moneylender that I will repay the money after, whatever it is that I agree to pay it by a certain amount of, whatever the terms of my loan that will never be repaid are, right? So I actually go lie to get money. Now, I don't know if you've tried to lie to get money from people, but they tend to follow you afterwards if you lie to financial institutions to get money, right? So we should think of this as essentially something that could end up in court, or some version of ending up in court, some version of encountering the law. So what I think we should think about is the example is not an ordinary example of a lie, but it's an example of a lie which can have legal penalties attached to it. It's an example of a lie that can be understood as a kind of fraud. Fraud means basically getting money by deception, right? So here's one other writer, Honora O'Neill, who's known as a Kantian scholar. She's actually Northern Irish, so doubly helpful to me to get a Northern Irish person who defends this interpretation of Kant. But she did very, very quickly, without it being a big deal. She said in her paper on Kant's virtues the following: the illustration in the second section of the groundwork, right, of perfect duties to others, the duty not to promise falsely, is a prototype for the duties of justice, or legal duties as I'm calling them, which are later elaborated in the doctrine of right, Rechtslehre. The action such duties demand, in this case not making false promises, is relatively well defined, and it is owed to specifiable others are going to be impacted if I don't pay it back. It can be legally enforced, for example, by giving those who are defrauded by false promisers rights of redress, which can be pursued in the courts. So she actually gave us already an explanation as to what this perfect duty to others is doing in the groundwork. So we should not think of the duty in the groundwork as an ethical duty at all. We should think of it as a prototype legal duty. Now, in the groundwork, Kant is not concerned with rights. He's not concerned with legality. Well, he's concerned with a certain meaning of legality whereby it passes the categorical imperative. That's small l legality. He's not concerned with giving his theory of rights in the groundwork. It's only the ethics. So what we've got is what will eventually become something in his theory of rights, what will eventually become something in his legal philosophy. He kind of gives it as a little, drops it in as a little sort of tease, but doesn't work it out, and doesn't claim in the groundwork to be giving you an elaborate actual theory of his duties. He actually says, I'm going to give you some illustrations, but he actually just, he gives you something that later gets transformed into a legal duty. That's the way I will read this part of the groundwork. So, okay, so that's the interpretation. And as I said, Honora O'Neill has given a similar interpretation without thinking that it really sort of is earth-shattering. This is really an earth-shattering thing to think about. But what's my support? Because if I just said that, you might think, well, okay, James, but aren't you getting a bit hung up on one example? Well, here is another little bit of support. Just a little bit of support. But I think it's going to go a long way. The next work that talks about the practical philosophy or moral philosophy in Kant is actually the Critique of Practical Reason in 1788. So here, if you turn to the Critique of Practical Reason, which isn't looked at as much, once again, Kant gives an example of a lie that's a lying promise to get money, right? So again, not a random casual example, but an example that's repeated in the Critique of Practical Reason. So it's obviously doing some work. Okay, but here's the thing. There's another example of a lie that Kant gives in the Critique of Practical Reason. What is it? Now again, when you and I are asked to talk about lies, we might give all sorts of examples about, the famous one that even Kant got into trouble with was lying that you have a prior engagement when somebody asks you to dinner and you don't want to go, right? These are casual lies. They will never end up in court, right? Nobody's going to bring you to court for having lied about how you didn't make it to that. Well, unless it was Obama's party and you didn't get the invite, then you. But anyway, let's just say nobody's going to bring you to court for having lied about you can't make it to the party on Saturday because you have to go and do this. But here's the other example that he actually gives in the Critique of Practical Reason. Quote, when the maxim on which I intend to give testimony is tested by practical reason, I always consider what it would be if I were to hold as a universal law of nature. It is obvious that in this way, everyone would be necessitated to truthfulness, for it cannot hold with the universality of a law of nature that statements should be allowed as proof and yet be intentionally untrue. So what is that? What is the lie of testimony that he's talking about? Clearly, it's perjuring yourself in a courtroom. So what he's saying is that we couldn't allow testimony, false testimony, in courtrooms to be used as proof for the guilt of people who were on trial. Again, giving false testimony under oath, perjury, is a crime. You will, if caught doing this, be subject to legal penalties. So the other example of a lie in the very soon after groundwork, the Critique of Practical Reason, is the crime of perjury. So the two examples in the Critique of Practical Reason, fraud and perjury. That's beginning to seem like all of these cases of lies are only cases of lies that in some way violate a law. Therefore, it gives support to the interpretation that this lie in the groundwork is a prototypical legal duty rather than merely an ethical duty. So that's where I'm going to now say we have an explanation of why there's this example in the groundwork. We have to see it as being really a sneaked in example of a legal duty. And now I'm going to turn to the final work of Kant on this subject, which I've alluded to, but I'm now going to say, if you look at the final writing on lies by Kant from 1797, the late work of the same year in which the Metaphysics of Morals are appointed, the supposed right to lie. So the bottom of this page 3, here are the 3 examples of duties not to lie that you get in the supposed right to lie essay. Just 3, not 2, not 4. 1, in a footnote, he has the perfect ethical duty to oneself, not to lie to oneself or to others. Interestingly, the right to lie with the murder at the door is not concerned with ethics. I know it sounds like, given all the things people write about that case, it's not an ethical paper. It's a paper in his philosophy of right or his legal philosophy. But he footnotes the ethics, just footnotes it, that's all, no more than a footnote. Second, a legal duty to others not to lie to others. That's the jurist sense of lie. That's what I'm saying is what we get in the groundwork example and what we get in the Critique of Practical Reason. That's my hypothesis. And then lastly, and famously, in the supposed right to lie paper, we get the one that's new to him in his published writings, the legal duty to humanity not to lie. That's why he wrote that paper, because his other writings had 1 and 2, but not the third. And so the supposed right to lie gives you the third for the first time in his published writings. It's in his lectures, but not in his published writings. Okay, so that's now my explanation of the 3 types of duties as summarized in the supposed right to lie paper. It explains what's going on in the groundwork as really just an early version of what gets to be in the legal philosophy. And we've got something new in the supposed right to lie. Okay, so if I'm right, then there are these 3 duties in Kant's mature moral philosophy that are 2 of them in what we call his legal philosophy or his philosophy of right, 1 of them in his ethics. Okay, so now I'm going to explain these 3 and show why they are different, and then leave us with the question of whether we are satisfied with this these 3 duties, and whether they're going to cover everything that we think should be covered. Okay, so page 4 of the handout. The first of the legal duties, which, as I said, is the one that I believe is what's going on in the groundwork and what's going on in the Critique of Practical Reason, but is actually only explicitly stated in the Doctrine of Right, first anyways. Okay, so here's the problem. I could say a lot, and I just don't have the time, about what's going on in the legal philosophy or the Doctrine of Right, but here's the quick version of what's going on in the legal philosophy or the Doctrine of Right. Kant is basically developing a set of legal duties not based on, strictly speaking, not based on the categorical imperative, which is the fundamental principle of ethics, but he's basing it on a principle which scholars debate as to whether it's independent of the categorical imperative or whether it's derived from the categorical imperative. I'm not too worried whether we think of it as being derived or independent, because it doesn't affect what I'm going to say, if it's derived or if it's independent. But basically, what we should think of it as, it's a basis for legality that's, strictly speaking, distinct from, as stated, the basis for ethics. Okay, so here is the basis for Kant's legal duties as given in the Doctrine of Right. Quote, Any action is right if it can coexist with everyone else's freedom in accordance with a universal law, or if on its maxim, the free, you specifically have a lie targeting an individual, violating that person's rights, harming that individual person, ends up in court. What's interesting about this second case is that Kant thinks that the lie to the murderer at the door that is basically a violation of a right of humanity. He thinks that is also something that can end up in the court. Now, have there been cases of that ending up in the court? I'm not sure, but that was his claim. But I'm not here to defend Kant yet, I'm just here to explicate Kant today. Finally, the ethics. Hey, what about the ethics? Didn't we start talking about the ethics? Okay, back to the ethics. Now we're back to the duty to oneself, not to lie. This is the ethical duty. That's duty number 1. So now we turn to finally the statement of this. In the Doctrine of Virtue, 1797, same year as the Doctrine of Right and the supposed right to lie paper, he says, quote, I've referred to this, in the Doctrine of Right, an intentional untruth is called a lie only if it violates another's right. That's what we talked about as number 1. But in ethics, or we talked about as the first thing we talked about, but in ethics, where no authorization is derived from harmlessness, we have a harmless lie, it is clear of itself that no intentional untruth in the expression of one's thoughts can refuse this harsh name. And again, quote, lying in the ethical sense of the word, intentional truth as such, need not be harmful to others in order to be repudiated, for it would then be a violation of the rights of others. It may be done merely out of frivolity or even good nature. The speaker may even intend to achieve a really good end by it. But his way of pursuing this end is, by its mere form, a crime. Now, crime, interestingly, that word crime, another word that I wish he hadn't used there, because crime connotes the very thing that he's avoiding by talking about the ethics and talking about harmlessness. So to be clearer, in the lectures on ethics, he's a bit more, I think, careful. In ethics, though, every false eloquium, every knowing deception is impermissible, even though it not be immediately coupled with an injury, that's legally an injury, and would not be imputable before a court of law. So, last example of a duty not to lie is the ethics, the ethical duty not to lie, and that is, quote, or as I summarize, lie is an intentional untruth to oneself or to another individual, and that's the kicker. This duty covers lies to oneself. Maybe crudely understood as self-deception, but there's a question about whether all self-deception are lies to oneself. So basically, the ethical duty covers lies you tell to yourself and lies you tell to others. And all of those are wrong because they fail to reflect. Okay, so now really that's the end of the explication of the 3 theories, why we can solve the puzzle of the groundwork, where it goes ultimately, which is in the jurist sense of duty, or the specifiable harm or rights violation. Here is what I'll leave you with, because I said I'm not going to defend Kant, but I am going to leave you with some problems that you might have about this move from the duty to others to the duty to oneself, why the ethics is only about a duty to oneself not to lie rather than a duty to others not to lie. Here are some problems. First of all, if you were to look at that famous ethical duty now to oneself not to lie, you'll find that the actual argument is pretty weak. It's basically an argument that says that you are acting against the purposiveness of speech, which is to communicate thoughts. That seems to be a very bad argument for a Kantian, right? So it seems to be about your natural speaking end, and there shouldn't be any natural ends in Kant that dictate ethics. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2, very quickly, it's middle of the page. The argument is supposed to be an argument for a duty to oneself as a moral being. Kant specifically says that it must be a duty to oneself as a moral being, not as a physical being or animal being. So, for example, not like the duty against suicide, which is not to end your animal life. But it looks very similar to the duty to oneself not to commit suicide against the kind of animal nature of one, to say that there's this natural purposiveness in your speech faculty to share your thoughts. That seems to be much more like an argument about natural teleology. So it's not supposed to be, and it seems to be. So even if it wasn't a philosophical problem, it seems to be a categorical error to put in an argument of that nature. And then finally, two thoughts I have. And this is where the end of the book will be puzzling, or be raising puzzles. It seems very peculiar that the duty not to lie in Kant in the Ethics covers both oneself and others. To me, it's like you have duties to oneself that cover yourself, you have duties to others that cover others. Why have you got a duty to oneself that covers yourself and others? It's doing more work than other duties to oneself than normal. And then lastly, I just have an ethical worry, but that's because I have very complicated thoughts about duties to oneself. I just worry that it doesn't capture my ethical intuitions. That's what's wrong about lying to you in the ethics, is what I do to myself and failing to respect myself when I lie to you. That seems ethically not to be where my mind is at when I think about why I shouldn't lie to people in ethical ways. But those problems with that ethical duty are basically, if you accept my interpretation that there is no perfect duty to others in Kant's ethics not to lie. There is only a perfect duty to oneself in his ethics not to lie. And the duties not to lie to others that are in a sense owed to others are all in his doctrine of right or his legal philosophy, not in his ethics. Okay, that's it. I hope I have